Hello, everyone. It's great to be here again with you. My name is Eduardo Jose Sanchez. Probably some of you know me. Anyway, I'm the coordinator of the Let's Slack platform. It's great to be here, join you in this webinar. As you know, this issue is quite interesting. So let me remind you some of the suggestions that we have for this webinar. As you see, we have a Q&A section, but we also have a chat section. So if you have any question, I will kindly ask you to do your questions through the Q&A section that you have in your computer. So this webinar is quite interesting. As you know, is about the overview of processes and provision for national determined contribution and case transparency framework. We have three amazing panelists. As you know, we in Let's Slack would like to promote the discussion on climate change. So together with UNF, CCC, we join forces to do this webinar. So as part of our agenda, we'll have an introductions from Ventura Silva, from the regional lead from the UNF CCC Regional Collaboration Center in St. George. Bernd Hackman will join us later. He's program officer for United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And his discussion will be about the overview of processes and key provision for the NDCs. And finally, we'll have Tugma Ikmeli, program officer from UNF CCC, and her presentation will be about the overview of key provisions and modalities for the case transparency framework. So at the end of each presentation, we'll have 5 to 10 minutes time for questions. So and at the end, we also have a closing remarks from basically trying to draw conclusions from all your questions and presentation. So Ventura, it's great to have you here. Please turn on your camera, and this webinar is all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eduardo, and thanks for LEDLAC for putting together this webinar. If you can move to the next slide. So the Regional Collaboration Center in St. George is one of the 6 regional collaboration centers. And sorry, I'm having some technical difficulty. Eduardo.
Yes. Ventura?
Please bear with me. I am fixing something. I have some technical difficulties. I'll join.
Okay, so Ventura, I guess that well, you go ahead with your solve your technical difficulties. We can move together with this. Hope that's okay with you. So as Ventura was saying, the collaboration centers are the way that UNF regional UNF CCC has to outreach some regions in the world. So in Latin America, we have one in St. George, which is headed by Ventura, and we have another one in Panama. So
thanks, Carlos. This is greetings from Grenada. It's a pleasure for us to join hands with RCC Panama and the team from Bonn and the UNDP in organizing this event. We've been supporting work on NDCs, and it's very timely that we touch upon this topic, where most of the Caribbean countries are considering incorporation of gender, mainstream of gender, and we also have the team from UNDP working on the Engender project, which is focusing on also addressing gender or gender inclusiveness in the climate change activities in the region. So it's a pleasure to join partner with you all, and great to have you all participate and look forward to an interesting discussions. Thank you. Back to you, sir.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ventura. If that's okay, thank you, Ventura, for all the remarks, and we can move ahead with Vern's presentation. So, Vern, I will kindly ask you to turn on your camera and please go ahead. Thank you very much. Vern, we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Very good. Then I go in presentation mode. So yeah, first of all, I would say thank you so much for having us in these difficult times. We really try to make this work through all these virtual means and try to provide the support and the help that we can, unfortunately here from Bonn. So we would love to be also more present in the region and actually talk directly to you. And as you mentioned already, it's an important topic that we are currently addressing and that we need to address, and that is it's the submission of NDCs, it's the preparation of NDCs, and as always here in the Secretariat, we very, very much count on you, on all your partner countries, on everyone who's out there in Latin America, because what we see in the NDC so far and also in this entire NDC process is really a strong commitment from your region, and that's really something that we would like to continue to support and like to see also this time. So therefore, I'm very, very pleased to be here with you and to give this presentation on basically an overview of the processes and key provisions for the NDCs, and that comes very timely to have such a webinar and also to have such a big group of people to talk to. Let me go into full presentation mode. As I said, my name is Ben Hackman. I'm working here at the UNFCCC for the last 10 years already and have supported and oversaw this entire NDC process that happened over the last almost since 2014 when the INDCs were born, and then it came into life, or it was really negotiated and agreed in the Paris Agreement. And since then, we're talking about the implementation and the preparation for the Paris Agreement. And now 2020 is actually supposed to be the year where it all enters into force and it all starts. Unfortunately, as you all know, the current situation is very, very special, very, very unique. We won't have the COP this year. Nevertheless, NDCs are on many people's radar, and I'll get back to also the current situation in a while. But let me start with NDCs really being at the heart of the Paris Agreement, and it's actually what brought the Paris Agreement to life, and what is also the most, or I would say, one of the key elements, and for the implementation and for reaching the goals, it is really the critical element of this entire agreement. And I always like to start these kind of presentations with this picture. What you see here is these are more than 150, 180 heads of state and heads of government. And they came to Paris not at the last day to say, oh, congratulations, we did a great job. But they actually came together on the very first day of the conference in Paris. And they wanted to send a very strong signal. And they wanted to send a signal that we need this agreement. We need to make this work. And we all together as a global community, we want to go in one direction. And I think the critical part here is that these guys normally don't come, they don't come together, and certainly not for an environmental issue. So they actually came because the Paris Agreement is much more. It is about development, and therefore NDCs are not only about mitigation or adaptation. It is actually an element of a development pathway for countries, and that is why it is so important and vital for the Paris Agreement. Now, putting these NDCs just very briefly, and I'm very sure you're familiar with that, and we hear also much more about it later from Tukba, into a context. So you see I put the NDCs on top of this slide, but I wanted to show you that NDCs are actually not a one-off, and then they are actually really the centerpiece of the Paris Agreement, because the first is the preparation and the submission of the NDCs, and that is exactly where we are right now. That is the first step on the top here, on the top part of the NDCs. From there, every country will then move into implementation phase and start implementing these NDCs. While you are implementing it, the next big element of the Paris Agreement will start to kick in, and that is the enhanced transparency framework. So while you're implementing the NDCs, you will also account for them, you will track the progress you are making, and you will report on your NDCs in the biannual transparency reports. These feed into a review process that is an expert review, but also facilitative multilateral consideration process where governments talk to each other and are asking questions about the NDC, about the implementation, about the progress being made. All this, again, also serves the purpose of collecting information. These information will then go into the global stock take, which is here the third very, very important, very big element of the Paris Agreement, for which then the NDCs form the basis. And the global stock take will then take stock of where we are, and from there send a recommendation, very likely, back to you, back to the parties, saying your next NDC has to be better than the last one, because we are not there yet. We still need more ambition, we still need more adaptation, we still need more finance. Go back to the drawing board, prepare your next NDCs. So that is where we are right now. One element and one slide is actually missing here, and that is because I saw Ventura's earlier presentation and he wanted to talk about this. So I skipped this slide, but I will bring it back verbally. The idea of the Paris Agreement is that NDCs are nationally determined. That means every country sets out its own objectives, its own targets, its own measures it wants to implement, and will do so on the basis of its capacities, on the basis of the support of the cooperation that it receives. However, every 5 years, new NDCs will be prepared. So now we have 2020, so the next one, 2025, 2030, and so on. And now the critical element, or the critical provision of the Paris Agreement, actually requires every country to have each NDC, each subsequent NDC, being a little bit better, or being better than the one before. That is very, very important, because that ensures that over time, parties will ramp up their ambition in a way that as a global community, we will achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So therefore, every 5 years, your NDC becomes a little bit better, or very much better, so that eventually we reach the ambition that is required for really implementing the agreement and for achieving its objectives. I think that is very important, because it again shows this cycle which I have here on the slides. It's actually saying that it is not a one-off process. It is not a one-off process in which we are right now when we are preparing NDCs, but it is a continuous process that, with the NDC as a starting point, feeding into different other elements, and then a better NDC has to be prepared in 5 years from now. So I think it is very important to keep that in mind when thinking about the preparation of NDCs, because it is not a one-off. It is a critical element in a broader Paris Agreement architecture, and it is the main vehicle for achieving the global objectives of the Paris Agreement. After Paris, we had another successful another successful COP. That was 2018, 2 years back from now, in Katowice. That was when the nitty-gritty parts, the details were negotiated and adopted in a way so that we could actually fill the Paris Agreement with life. And this is also what we will talk about today. So we know about the concept of NDCs, and today is then much more also about the relevant provisions, the timeframes, and everything that we are now operating under, which is important for 2020 because, yeah, as I said, it is the year when you will prepare or are preparing the next round of NDC. So it is actually the year when it all starts. But we very often, especially now, get the question, so what is happening in 2020? What exactly is there that needs to be done? Well, the first thing is each country that does not yet have an NDC in the NDC registry is required to do so. And the reason for that is because the Paris Agreement requires each of its parties to have an NDC registered in the NDC registry at any time. So that means those that don't have one, first step now is to prepare an initial NDC. Then we also have, we saw that prior to Paris, INDCs were communicated, and most of these INDCs have been then turned into NDCs. So when you look at the NDC registry, you'll see that many of the NDCs that are registered and recorded there still have in their title intended national determined contribution. And the reason for that is because many countries, once they ratified the Paris Agreement, they sent an email to the Secretariat saying, "Dear Secretariat, please take our INDC as our first NDC." And so we just transferred it from the INDC registry into the NDC registry and locked it into the formal process under the Paris Agreement. However, these NDCs that are currently in the registry, they are in many cases outdated because they have been prepared prior to Paris, and many countries wanted also back then when the Paris Agreement was negotiated, they wanted to have an opportunity to put forward, let's say, a fresh, an updated NDC for the time when the Paris Agreement starts. So therefore, there is in the Paris decision, there are 2 paragraphs that actually say those countries with an INDC and a time frame up to 2025, those are just a very few, but still there are, they should by 2020 communicate a new NDC, and those countries that have a time frame up to 2030, which is really the majority of countries, they could either communicate or update their NDC by 2020. And that is exactly the process we are currently in, and that is the process many of you are working on. All these NDCs, they will be communicated to us, to the Secretariat. They will then be recorded in the NDC registry. And I highlight here the word interim because it is not yet finalized. There's still negotiations as to how it looks like. And you will see, I will show you later a slide on it. It is really not yet finalized. There's still some work to do. Also for 2020, the Secretariat will prepare a synthesis report on these NDCs. And we will prepare it for the next COP, for COP26, to give everyone an overview of where we are. What is the content of the NDCs? What is in there? Where are we, right? And then also in 2020, this is not really related, but in many cases, of course, it is linked. And Let's Luck, as a platform, knows really a lot about this and also how to link NDCs with the long-term strategies, because 2020 is also the year where the Paris Agreement is inviting all countries to communicate long-term low-emission development strategies to the Secretariat as well, and we will upload them on the website so that they are transparently available to everyone. I already spoke about the NDC Interim Registry, so if you go to our website, and then the registry, you will find this entry. You can look for the NDCs. You will then very likely be a little bit confused because you look at it and you don't see, but who communicated a second NDC, who communicated an update? What are all these documents? So therefore, we created also, you see it here on the left-hand side, this click for the latest submissions. That is something you click on that list, and then you at least see a tally of everything that has been communicated in the last month. So that gives you a very good overview of where are we with the new and the updated NDCs. Because if you go to the normal functions of the registry, you will just get a list of countries in an alphabetical order. So that doesn't tell you whether this country already submitted something or not, and if so, what it is. So therefore, we created this click here for the latest submission link, so that at least you get a good overview of where we are right now. I also mentioned that the Secretariat will prepare a synthesis report on the NDCs. And if you are working for government, I'm sure you have heard about this, but on the 13th of August, more or less a month ago, the Secretariat, or our Executive Secretary, Patricia Espinosa, she sent a notification to parties, basically saying that on 28th of February, the Secretariat will be publishing an initial version of this NDC synthesis report. And all NDCs that arrive here at the Secretariat and that will be registered in the NDC registry by the 31st December 2020. So that's very unfortunate for us, because that means our New Year and our Silvester celebrations are a little bit jeopardized, but we will make sure all this will go into the NDC registry, and then those that we have received by that date will find its way into the NDC synthesis report that we are preparing. However, and I wanted to stress this, 2020 is not a normal year. It's not a normal year here in Bonn, and it's not a normal year in, I would say, every country around the world, due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think we all need to be very mindful that this is causing new priorities to governments, and that in many cases also the NDC preparation process in many countries is impacted by this pandemic. So therefore, the Secretariat will update this initial NDC synthesis report another time closer to COP26 to make sure that we can really get a report with as many NDCs in there as possible. Now, one important note from or plea from our side: if it's possible, kindly let us, let the Secretariat know if you're in the process of preparing an NDC and you have an idea as to when you more or less want to submit it. Kindly let us know about this so that we can plan our work. Because as I said, the deadline for these NDCs and for the synthesis report will fall into the Christmas and into the New Year period here, and we kind of need to try to get our head around how can we best allocate our stuff and how can we best allocate our time to make sure that there will be a Christmas, and also the support that governments need in order to submit their NDCs to the Secretariat. Next, we spoke a lot about what is the process of NDCs, but I also briefly wanted to share with you this need for higher ambition of NDCs. As you know, I guess many of you were also participating in the last COP, in Madrid. One of the key outcomes in Madrid was the decision 1 CMA2, which was actually highlighting climate ambition. it was making a very strong case that 2020 is the opportunity for all countries to reflect highest possible ambition in their NDC updates or in their new NDCs. And I think it is very important to keep that in mind. There are many, let's say, rather technical reasons as to why an NDC should be updated. That is because better data is available. That is because new partnerships, new cooperation arose. That is because also there was a lot of development on the ground. Many new policies have been adopted and so on. So these are very important reasons to update an NDC or to prepare a new NDC now. But the COP last year was also highlighting very, very strongly that there is an emission gap, an ambition gap that needs to be filled in order for the global community to reach the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Basically the 1.5 or 2 degree emission pathways and trajectory. So therefore, when preparing these new and updated NDCs, consider this gap, and parties have been urged to really consider this gap and reflect highest ambition in these NDCs, of course, in the context of capacities, in the context of your country, basically. But I think it's an important element of the negotiating process that came out last year in Madrid. And lastly, the last part of this presentation is really a little bit about what is so important about these NDCs. Yes, of course, they are on one hand sending or kind of manifesting the climate contribution each country is making. They are setting out the ambition. They are setting out targets, projects on everything that the country wants to do or plans to do or pledges to do. But they are also, as I said earlier, they are also the basis for everything that is there to come. So once you submit your NDC to the NDC registry now, it will be locked in there for the next 5 years until you submit the next one in 2025. And from then on, you actually have to follow up on what is in this NDC. There is on one hand, of course, the implementation, but on the other hand, also the accounting and the tracking of progress and the enhanced transparency framework. That is where each country then has to actually look into its NDC and also into the progress it's making, and has to provide information as to where we are in this implementation process. How is it going? Are we on a trajectory, on a pathway towards achieving our NDCs? And then it's and all this will then be reviewed and become again the basis for solid decision making at the global stocktake for the next round of NDC. So it's something where I think it's worthwhile to spend some time to get let's say a proper document out there. And in that context, I wanted to highlight that governments at the Katowice COP agreed on a set of information elements that should be included in an NDC. It's what we call the information necessary for clarity, transparency, and understanding, or very often just referred to as Ictu or ICTU. And that is something that all parties shall provide the information necessary for clarity, transparency, and understanding when you prepare your NDC and communicate them. The specific guidance, the ICTU guidance, is applicable to your respective NDC. So that means it's not a one-size-fits-all. NDCs are all different. It was impossible to create a guidance that is, that determines for each of these different NDCs what kind of information should be provided. But it does give an idea of what has to be provided, what information should be included in an NDC, and then it's up to each country to decide to which extent does that apply to my NDC, or maybe not. I think it's very important to note that this guidance is for everything that is happening this year. It is not mandatory. It is strongly encouraged to use this guidance, but it's not mandatory. But it will be mandatory for the next round of NDCs in 2025. So therefore, here at the Secretariat, we are not strongly encouraging parties, but we are encouraging parties to use this guidance, apply this guidance, and to make first experience in applying it. Because right now, it's not mandatory. Mistakes can be made. It's something really to learn in this process, and to get ready for what is there to come in 5 years when this guidance needs to be applied to your respective NDCs. And I just want to briefly give you a gist of what is in there. It's actually an elaboration of these headings. There should be quantified information on your NDC. It's basically describe your NDC. There should be a time frame, and most of you have done that in your current NDCs already. Also, what is the scope and coverage of your NDCs? What are the planning processes that are behind the preparation of NDCs? Are there climate laws? Are there participation processes, and so on? The next one would be about the accounting more. How do you account? How do you add up the emissions that lead to your target, and how do you develop the baseline for that? But also, why do you consider your NDC being fair and being ambitious? And I think that is important because this provides a context for every country to explain the NDC and to put it into the context of national circumstances and also of the capacities that are available. And then lastly, how should the NDC contribute towards achieving the objectives, both then later of the convention and of the Paris Agreement? So that is where, again, a narrative is required to put this NDC also a little bit more in a global context. And I think all this information and all this guidance in the end really aims to provide the necessary information to make an NDC understandable to others. I'm not saying comparable, because these are really apples and pears. They shouldn't be compared. But others who read NDCs should understand what is this all about, and where do we place this kind of action and information? How do we place it in the context of each specific country? I also wanted to touch upon the other elements of NDCs. So we have this ICTU guidance, but it needs to be very clear from when you look here. You could very easily see that this is very mitigation focused. However, it is very important to note that this guidance is not, or is without any prejudice to the inclusion of other components. So that means it is not limiting what you want to put in your NDC. It is just structuring parts of it to make sure that others can understand. And that was particularly important for also the inclusion of adaptation, which is in the Latin American and also Caribbean region, just a critical element of life, but and with that also then of the NDCs, to include the adaptation communication as a component or in conjunction with your NDC. And there I just wanted to note, I'm not going into detail, but there's also guidance on this adaptation communication that parties may want to apply to structure it, to kind of have an idea of what kind of elements, what should be included there. And then I think it is very important to note that some parties, and that is none of the countries from your region, but I think it's still important to know that some NDCs consists of mitigation co-benefits in accordance with the Article 4.7 of the Paris Agreement. So that is not relevant for your region. But still, I think important, to note. And these NDCs then shall also include the ICTU guidance as it's applicable to their own NDC. With that, I come to the end of my presentation, but have a last slide afterwards. And this is where I just wanted to put together, and I'm sure colleagues at Let's Luck can make these presentations available to everyone, but that is where we collected information from parties from around the world, providing reasons as to why they are updating their NDCs. And I mentioned a couple of them, but I summarized it all, or we summarized it all here. There are many reasons to update an NDC. One is really what I mentioned more in detail, is the ambition and raising the ambition, which is critical to reach the objectives of the Paris Agreement. But there are also many others, other reasons that parties considered important now for the process of updating their NDCs. Now I go back to my second to last slide and just say, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for joining this morning. It's a pleasure for us to reach out, and if there are any questions, I think we have time to discuss these now, but we are also always available for everyone to send us an email, and that is even more true now during these times of Corona, where where direct contact is hardly or actually not possible, but still our work needs to continue, needs to be done. So therefore, we are happy to provide any kind of support we can on this process, on the preparation process, on the submission process, also on the ICTUs. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate. We will do our best to answer these. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Bernd, thank you very much. Quite an interesting presentation. I have a few questions, but prior to my questions, some of our audience is not quite, I don't know, able in this discussion about the NDCs. So for those of us that are not directly involved in the discussions about the NDCs, I would like to bring a question from our audience that basically about the mandatory nature of the NDCs. So we always assume the NDCs is quite mandatory because the Paris Agreement is covered in the Paris Agreement. But how mandatory is the NDC for a country, and who does the follow-up of the NDCs?
That is a very good question, and I think we hear also later from my colleague Tukba when we talk about the enhanced transparency framework. I think there are different levels of follow-up. One is the Paris Agreement requires every country, and that is then mandatory to prepare, communicate, and maintain an NDC at any time. So that means the preparation is mandatory for everyone, for every country. The follow-up of this will happen now in different at different stages or at different levels. One follow-up is the reporting of the implementation and the reporting of the progress that is being made through the enhanced transparency framework, because you're absolutely right. The NDCs are not a top-down approach. It is actually a bottom-up approach. Every country has the responsibility to design its own NDC with its own targets, but then also has the responsibility to implement this and to follow up on this. So you report on this and you track the progress on this NDC through your through the Enhanced Transparency Framework. That is also a part of the Paris Agreement. So basically, there is a strong element of national determination, of self-determination of what each country wants to do. But once it comes forward and pledges basically what it wants to do and communicates it to us and to the global community, saying we want to do X, Y, and Z, and mitigation, adaptation, whichever elements, then it's the responsibility of this country to live up to it. So, and that means the implementation of it is a nationally owned process, and then there is also a reporting, an accounting process, and a tracking of progress related to it, where each country every 2 years then has to provide basically an update of where it is, like where it is with the implementation of the NDC vis-a-vis the objectives of the NDC. So therefore, these levels are there. There's once this international level where the report goes into this international process that is under the UNFCCC. And then there is the implementation, which is also purely a domestic issue. So of course, with the support of others, together with financial contributions from other sides, from development partners and so on, but the responsibility lies with the country. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Bernd, there's another question that I have from your presentation, is that in 2014 or 15, we saw some kind of rush from several countries trying to move ahead with a number towards the NDC, towards the first NDC in Paris. And from 2016 to 2019, 2020, we saw many countries doing or making less efforts in terms of NDC implementation. And right now we have a new round of NDCs, and we're seeing another rush in terms of NDCs. But the problem is that many of the information that they're analyzing right now is not quite there. I mean, the incertitude relevant reference in terms of the NDCs is basically the same that we have in 2015 or a little bit better. So one of the problems that we are seeing in many countries is that when in 2015 they presented the reference scenarios, many of those reference scenarios wasn't quite properly done. So the problem is that they showed emission levels that were real, and that what is happening right now is that this reference scenario is going to change. So at the same time, probably in many cases, or in some cases, so for example, if we're reporting 100 tons, they're now reporting 80 tons. Well, it's some sort of reference. But the problem is that at the same time, you have a non-backsliding principle in the Paris Agreement. So how can the countries that are trying to improve the numbers deal with the fact that the numbers that they presented in 2015 weren't that transparent or honest, or I don't know, and the fact that they are trying to improve towards transparency in this number and deal with the non-backsliding principle?
That is a question we hear very often, and that's a critical question. You will get an answer from me that is not very clear cut, but I'll do my best to get the message across. The thing is that the Paris Agreement really starts in 2020. So you have this process, and when you look at the decision, you communicate or update something by 2020, and then from then on, you will have every 5 years this new process. So from that, you see there is a kind of a gray zone between 2015 and 2020. And one of the reasons for the creation of this gray zone is maybe also because the Paris Agreement entered into force only 1 year after its adoption. That never happened nowhere in the UN that something so quickly entered into force. I think that is one of the reasons why we are talking about this NDC preparation process now, and not only about the ambition, because one of the key messages I want to get across is that now is the time to be serious. Now is the time to really put something on the table, because you will be held accountable for that. So far, there has been no process around this, but from now on, governments then have to report on the implementation of the NDCs and also on the construction of the NDCs. So you have to report on how do you come up with the baseline, how do you account for, how do you get to the number that you are presenting. And this will be reviewed and go through an international process where other countries will then ask questions and in an open manner. So it's also a process where both the findings from these reviews, the review reports, everything will be made publicly available. So that means there is now an incentive to try to get things right. But I also want to say that we are at the very beginning of something new, and that now there is that we have to keep in mind that a lot of learning has to happen, a lot of capacity building, a lot of, I mean, you know best, you are working excellently in the region for such a long time, yet the capacity building needs are getting rather more than less, right? So I think we need to be very mindful of that, and we need to provide the support, the help we can. But I think the idea of the Paris Agreement, which then starts as of this year, next year with the COP, is you put forward an NDC as a country and you own it. You own it from A to Z. You own the implementation, you own the reporting, you own the accounting, and you go with it. And the idea then of the agreement is that you get better over time. So I do appreciate a lot when countries are rushing into higher ambition, because that is what we need. We need a lot of ambition, and we need it very, very fast. But this ambition is maybe counterproductive if it is not real, right? Because what you're doing is not only not achieving it, but you also maybe put a little bit this whole agreement at risk. Because if in 5 years everyone realizes, oh, all these NDCs mean nothing and are not implemented or are not accounted for, is this really the agreement that is helping? And therefore, I think we need to now work, rather in small steps, but do a lot of work on the ground, a lot of solid work that is on the accounting, on the preparation of baselines, and then it sounds very, very simple, but that is huge on the implementation of all of this. And I think we need to acknowledge this a little bit, and it is a huge amount of work that is there in front of us.
Quite interesting response. There's a question from Claudia Vallejo. She's asking about the ICTU guidance, where can it be found, and if this guidance is of free access.
Exactly, it is of free access. It is available on our website. I will share with you the link later via email, and maybe you can circulate it to the participants. It is a decision that has been agreed 2 years ago by all parties, and it's actually providing a framework of how you can prepare your NDC. And I was quite well, not surprised. I was very pleased when I saw, for example, the NDC that came in from Jamaica. They actually prepared along this ICTU guidance in a kind of tabular format, where they say element A, and then they provided the information that was required for that, element B, and they provided. So on the NDC registry, you will find so far the submitted NDCs, and from the region, Jamaica, in my view, did a very good job in not only applying this guidance, but kind of structure the whole NDC accordingly. And the same was done by Singapore, the same was done by Moldova, by Norway. So more and more countries are using this guidance to structure the NDC and to provide the information that is required. But I will share the link with you later on.
Great, Bernd. And one final question. You mentioned that the countries should submit the NDC, the updated NDC by December 31st. What happened if the countries, I mean, taking into account that the COP is next November 2021, and what happened if the countries, because of technical issues, present the NDCs, let's say in March or February?
I would say that everyone is fully aware of the current situation, and if this process falls behind because governments currently have other priorities, I think this is what the general understanding is. There was recently also an interview by the COP presidency saying, for the COP, we expect your new NDCs. In the Secretariat, of course, we need to hold up the decision by parties to communicate by 2020. That is what we do, but also in the notification by the Executive Secretary, it was clear that we will prepare one synthesis report with everything that has been submitted to us by the end of 2020, and an update to that closer to the COP because of the current situation. It is, yeah, an unprecedented year for all of us.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bernd. So now it's time for Tugba to make a presentation. Thank you, Bernd, for your most interesting presentation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Tugba, welcome. And it's all your audience now. Thank you. Bye. Tugba, your mic, I think, is closed.
Okay, sorry for the heads up, and good morning, everyone. So also, Eduardo, thank you. And I also would like to thank Bernd for this very comprehensive presentation. So
Tugba, sorry, I'm really sorry. Could you please speak a little bit louder? We can hear you very well.
Is it better now?
A little bit.
It's okay. Let me also just turn this more. Actually, maybe I should just turn my camera off.
No, it's fine. No, it's fine. Thank you.
I think it's better now. Okay. So just let me, so I hope you can see my presentation on the screen. And I also would like to thank you for giving us this opportunity to talk to you on these very important topics under the Paris Agreement, actually. So I believe NDC is the heart of the Paris Agreement, and the enhanced transparency framework is the backbone of it, actually. And with this presentation, I would like to present a brief overview about the enhanced transparency framework, which we call it the ETF. And we'll also touch upon some key points to be considered for a successful implementation. And I'm working with the UNFCCC for 2 years now, and I'm supporting all of the work on NDCs and also some ETF, especially to support the developing countries, to support in a way to enhance their technical capacities to better address all these requirements came with the Paris Agreement. But we are also working to support them for MRV issues, and therefore I also would like to briefly touch upon the comparison between the MRV and ETF. So we all know MRV very well, because it is very well structured, laid under the convention for very long years. And the enhanced transparency framework is actually now established under the Paris Agreement, and it is building on these MRV arrangements. But in an overview, as a framework, actually these are called transparency arrangements. And very briefly, these arrangements oblige parties to communicate the information relevant for implementation of the convention or the Paris Agreement, of course, and to communicate information on emissions, and removals, also on actions, and also on support. So why they are providing this information? Because then all this information enables us, all the parties, and also the convention to have accurate and reliable data, and also forms an essential basis for understanding the current emission levels, for example, or the ambition of the existing efforts. It also shows us progress in both the national and international scale. And it also helps, I believe, as a result of these, building trust and confidence among the parties. But these are more related with the mandates based on the convention and the Paris Agreement. But in addition to these, I think transparency arrangements also bring some additional benefits, including informing domestic policies and plans, and also can facilitate access to support from developed countries, as well as it supports capacity building, political buy-in, and increased awareness at the national level. So, as we just explained, the Paris Agreement is very well established under the Article 13 of it, and it is actually a framework, a transparency framework for action and support. So, for example, the purpose of transparency for action is to provide a clear understanding of actions undertaken by parties in terms of NDCs or adaptation actions, and it actually compiles, aims to provide a compiled overview of the actions. In addition to this, the purpose of transparency for support means having clarity on the support provided and received by individual parties, and also to provide a full overview of the total financial supports provided. So all of these information eventually, of course, will feed into this global stocktake, as explained within the Burns presentation. And this global stocktake is actually a mechanism on determining the collective progress towards achieving the purpose and long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. So this enhanced transparency framework is a kind of individual tracking of the actions and support. So it will be country-based transparency, but all this information will then feed into the global stocktake, which will show us if we are at the level where we should be, if we have enough ambition, enough action to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement, or also if we have enough support provided to developing countries. So it will be showing us, hopefully in 2023, this is the date for the first global stocktake, whether we are on track or not to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So now I also would like to just show you here that an overview of the transparency framework, because it has three phases actually. First one is reporting, the second phase is the review, and the third phase is the multilateral consideration of this information. So, for example, this figure actually provides the core structure, and as you see, maybe I should also indicate that this core structure is actually built by the Paris Agreement, but right after that, with the Katowice climate package, there is another set of provisions adopted, which we call them as the MPGs, and it is the modalities, the procedures and guidelines which are elaborating all provisions necessary for implementing the enhanced transparency framework. And based on these information, what I can tell is, with this framework, now all parties must report their national greenhouse gas inventory reports, for example, and also must report their progress in implementing and achieving their NDCs. In addition to that, as appropriate, parties can also provide information on their adaptation actions, but on the finance side, developed countries they have to provide the support provide information on support, while the developing countries may, they are expected to provide this information on support they needed and they received, but it is not mandatory for developing countries. And so when all this information, all this reporting will be done by the biennial transparency reports under the ETF. And once the transparency reports, these BTRs, are submitted, they will undergo an expert review, a technical expert review process. So all parties will undergo that process, and then the outcome of this, the report of this process will form the basis for this multilateral consideration following that step, that phase. So in a nutshell, this is what we have for the transparency framework. But as I said, this is the enhanced transparency framework, and it is building on the existing MRV arrangements. So you may ask, oops, sorry, what are the differences, or what is enhanced? And in that context, actually, it is, of course, no surprise that several reporting elements or requirements are similar, and also the steps are somehow similar. So we still have, for example, in reporting under MRV, the biennial update reports for developing countries and biennial reports for developed countries. So in enhanced transparency framework, we will only have biennial transparency reports, which will be valid for all parties. Also in MRV system, we have technical analysis and review processes for developed and developing countries. So we have always two-track options for these phases under MRV. So with the enhanced transparency framework, now we have common sets of provisions applicable to all parties. But of course, I should say that this MPGs provide some flexibilities to those countries, to those developing countries that need it according to their capacities or their needs. And this allows some built-in flexibilities and some reporting scope, some flexibilities in terms of scope of the reportings. But this doesn't mean that they will not report such contents elements. They will not have to report such contents. No, the flexibility arrangements will apply to the developing countries, having in mind that they should somehow indicate which flexibility they need, why do they need, and how they can improve to fulfill those requirements in the future. So this framework, the enhanced ETF, also brings in this continuous improvement and to the requirement to identify and regularly update the required information to be reported. Another point I would like to tell is that the ETF also has introduced an improved detail and scope of reporting, as well as more mandatory elements. So it all has, mostly it has shells. The reporting elements to be included in the BTRs are mandatory, for example. But of course, this has to be read with the flexibility arrangements provided. So I also would like to just present this slide because I think the ETF has very specific direct linkages with all other provisions of the Paris Agreement. For example, with NDCs. So it is closely related or linked with the NDCs in terms of both information, accounting, and tracking, because as Bernd already provided us that all parties have to prepare an NDC, including these ICTU elements. And then they will be accounting their progress, their NDCs, and then they will be giving the result of this accounting in their BTRs as under the name of tracking of progress in implementation and achieving on NDCs. So in terms of information, as well as in terms of the methodologies or other information provided by the NDCs, should be really very consistent with the information provided in the BTRs. In that terms, ETF is closely linked with NDCs to ensure the consistency among all processes related with NDCs. Another linkage I would like to voice is that this adaptation reporting, because yes, NDCs can include adaptation information, but there is also these adaptation communications separately referred by the Paris Agreement. So it is up to each party actually to choose whichever reporting channel they would like to use to report their actions on adaptation. So there are some channels, arrangements. For example, they can provide this information as adaptation communication. And this adaptation communication can be a separate document, or it can be also a part of its NDC. But this adaptation information can also be provided by national communications or by within as a section, as a chapter in their biennial transparency reports. So here, what to be considered by each and every party is to really think of the best way to reflect, to provide this information, and to cross-reference information if necessary to prevent any additional burden, especially on developing countries. Another linkage I would like to highlight would be the global stocktake, of course, because the report submitted and prepared under the Enhanced Transparency Framework will be among the input sources for the global stocktake. For example, the BTRs, the national inventory reports, or some other information on support will directly feed into the global stocktake for a collective, for an aggregate analysis or stocktaking of the actions in the higher level. So it is again directly linked with this further phases of the Paris Agreement. And lastly, there is another direct linkage, which we call the committee. Actually, it is the committee to facilitate the implementation and compliance with the Paris Agreement. So it is basically an expert-based committee, and they will try to ensure everyone is able to implement the Paris Agreement and they are complying with its provisions. So, for example, if a party fails to submit a mandatory report within this process, this committee can initiate a consideration, and is as similar. So, for example, if a party has some concerns and has some problems or inconsistencies in terms of providing information, they can also initiate such a consideration with the consent of the party, with a view to find out what are the problems and how to help these countries. So each and every country can be able to fully implement, successfully implement the Paris Agreement. So again, the information reported under the Enhanced Transparency Framework, or the failing to apply these processes or provisions, will have the linkage with this committee to initiate its consideration of matters. So as you see, actually the Paris Agreement, its NDC and the ETF actually brings in many obligations for parties, and actually it also requires the information to be submitted, to be reported in a timely manner and in a continuous manner. For example, there are some deadlines, there are these biennial transparency reports every 2 years, or national communications every 4 years, and these will be all applicable to all parties with the ETF. So to ensure this, the MPGs also require that each country to provide information on its institutional arrangements, especially in place for its NDC purposes or inventory purposes, or how they are assessing impacts of climate change, or how they're going to report on their adaptation actions, how they're going to address the needs, the supports needed and received. So there are many elements to be considered by parties, and in that context, we believe very strong institutional arrangements will be vital, enabling all countries to provide this information in a reliable way, in a comprehensive way, and in a continuous way. And I think there is another point to consider here, because this process will also require engagement with a broad range of stakeholders. So these institutional arrangements somehow should also serve this process, and also provide information to national decision makers, to other stakeholders. And by only having these in place, the parties will be able to fulfill their requirements in a timely manner and on a sustainable basis. So maybe I can also provide some very brief practical aspects towards this transition to ETF, because as we know, parties are still preparing, and they are to prepare their biennial update reports, and the final BURs will be the ones submitted latest by the end of 2024. But we also know that the first BTR comes into the picture. It is again due by the latest by the end of 2024. So these BTRs will replace the BURs. But note that the inventories will be continued for developed countries, and national communications will continue to be submitted by all parties every 4 years. In here, I should also indicate that based on their very unique situations, LEDs and LDCs and SIDs actually may submit their first BTRs at their discretion. But what we suggest is actually it would be very useful if each and every party can start actually continue working on their BURs while also having a consideration thinking about the BTRs or their requirements, because this can help to move to have this transition in a more fluid way and in a more efficient way. So as in closing, actually, I think the existing MRV arrangements actually provide an opportunity to test run, as I just mentioned, to test run the domestic systems and arrangements if they are complying also with the enhanced transparency framework, because this will enable parties to facilitate a better planning and to identify the areas where support is needed from a very early stage. And actually, by continuing to enhance these efforts to prepare and submit the national communications and the BURs, actually the developing countries will be able to see their to develop their national capacities, also to implement the enhanced transparency framework. But above all, it is the ownership, the political buy-in, and also the access to support are among the most important essential ingredients for a successful implementation. And actually, we are also trying to provide some documents, some materials for parties, and with some publications and with many trainings or webinars or any other means to support this capacity building. For example, there there are very recent two publications, one by CG, another, yes, they are prepared by the help of the consultative group of experts. Because if you don't know, if you haven't heard about the CG or this consultative group of experts, actually it is a constituted body under the convention, and it also serves the Paris Agreement, and with a view to support the capacities of developing countries and to enhance their countries. And they already published several training materials or publications on Mrv and Etf, so you can always access them through our website, through the CG website, and these are also, here you can also see our email account, so you can always contact us, send us your questions on Mrv, on NDCs, or on ETF. So we are always here to support you, and we just want to support the countries as much as we can. So that's the end of my presentation, Eduardo, and I will be happy to answer questions. Maybe I should turn on my camera. I hope there no problems have been faced due to my connection. Okay,
no,
so okay, great.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just for all of you, just remember that all the materials you will be able to find in the Let's Lack webpage. You will be have a section of additional materials where you can find the page of the webinar, all the information regarding this webinar. So going to the questions, Tukba, and well, many of our audience just write your questions in the Q&A section. You mentioned the Mrv is the backbone of all this process, and I do agree with you, but at the end, the backbone of the Mrv is also to make sure that a tone reported is a tone in fact reduced. So it sounds simple, but it's quite complicated. So behind of this sentence, the emission factor is the key. So as you know better than all of us, the countries report with different emission factors. So at the end, we don't know if those tones are comparable. In your presentation, I didn't saw any reference to the emission factors and the work that can be done by the countries or the countries with the UNF, the CCC, to reduce uncertainty towards the emission factor. So what will be your suggestion in that regard?
Well, this is a very nice question or remark, actually. What I can say is that I try to keep my presentation in a brief format, but actually under the enhanced transparency framework, so parties will be providing information on their national inventories, and at that point, at that section, it really hits what you say. So every country has to prepare, estimate their emissions, and they have to provide this information in accordance with some guidelines, and these are the 2006 IPCC guidelines. So we have some clarity actually on these on the provisions related with these, but of course not every country can estimate their country-based or tier 3 emission factors. So according to these guidelines, there are sometimes 1 or 2 or 3 tiers for different categories or different emission sources. So it is actually for key categories, what is expected is to have the most certain, the least uncertainty level of estimations, and it comes with the country-based emission factors. But what we know is it is not possible for some of the countries, based on some capacity constraints, based on data availability, or even based on technical staff, to analyze, to assess, or to estimate these emission factors. So what I see is that we are at the point that especially the developing countries will start something from some point, and we will evolve and reach a better level, a better system in the coming years over a period of time. This is also how we see that that will come with the ETF. Actually, even when we see the inventories from the developed countries, we still see that they have some struggles with the estimation of their emissions, with applying the required level of tiers in their inventory. So I think that will be an important topic for everyone, for all partner organizations on the ground to support all these countries to be able to address all the provisions. But as a starter, I really don't expect that everyone will be at the same level with the perfect data and all the systems to collect them. So we will need some time. And I also would like to address one more point, because yeah, it is somehow also related with the NDCs in your question to Bernd. So yes, we also see some differences in the subsequent NDCs, but it is really complicated, because sometimes they are developing their baselines based on some old data, and now they have started to compile and analyze more recent data, and with some further guidelines, IPCC, with recent guidelines, and with other emission factors. So that might be also the reason behind these differences, but I believe in over time they will be more consistent and accurate, and that's the world waiting for us in front of us now, I guess.
Great. There's a question from Aaron Rodriguez. Does the ETF have a specific provision on MRVs for climate finance?
For climate finance, I couldn't catch. So yes, actually, the ETF has specific provisions on which information to report in the BTRs, but there are different sets of provisions for developed countries and for developing countries. For example, for developed countries, they have to provide information on the financial support they provided. And for the developing countries, it is not a must, it is not a shall provision, but they are expected to provide information on the financial resources they need and also they received. So this is to keep track of the whole picture, and also to see if their needs are somehow addressed by the finance provided. So they are all these are all can be found in the decisions from the Katowice package. So I can also circulate all that MPGs and all other materials right after this webinar.
Great, thank you. We only have a couple of minutes, and I have a question for both of you, Bernd and Tugbe. As you know, Let's Lack is a platform of the people for the people. I mean, we are just people talking about climate change. My question will be, how do you see the role of civil society towards the NDC? I mean, in this critical moment, where do you think that civil society groups can be more assertive towards the NDC's increase of ambition and NDC implementation from 2020 on?
Maybe I can start, and then if you wish, Bern, or you can start. Okay, well, actually, what I see, the civil society is an important stakeholder, and actually we are the people we are living on, so the civil society is actually all of us. So, but of course, it is how the decisions are taken within these scopes for, I mean, in some time earlier. So it must, what I see, I can say, or let me put it like that. So recently, or in the years, so the role of civil society is really enhanced, and it is very much stronger now, I guess. And actually, what we see within all these formal decisions from the COP, so there is a role for civil society. For example, even within the global stocktake, so the civil society voice will be heard, and the reports they are going to prepare will be a part of this global stocktake at the higher levels. So they have a very important role, and I think they are also promoting and triggering ambition at the national level within their countries, because what we see from the NDCs is that actually now they are prepared with a larger stakeholder involvement, and this enables civil society to provide input to such processes, and I think it is one of the most important roles they have, especially in terms of increasing the ambition, having the chance to also provide information to decision makers and have a part in this very important process. But I'm sure Bernd may have some other points to add, so over to you, Bernd.
Thanks, Tova, and as always, there's not much to add to what you say, but let me maybe bring in one aspect, and because Eduardo, you asked it also earlier, what about the accountability for an NDC? Who's owning the NDC? An NDC could be just another government document. But as we also discussed, really the difficult part of an NDC is to implement it, to reach this ambition, not just to rush into putting something together and send it to the UNFCCC. And exactly this part, the implementation, the ownership, is something for the civil society. No government can implement it against the will of its own people. So in the end, society needs to, and I think especially you also have this for the LETs. It has to be kind of country owned, and with that owned by the society. They have to want it. They have to say this is important for us as a country, as a society. And writing or preparing then in the end, the NDC is actually just the tip of the iceberg, that you are just bringing together all this momentum, all this work that has been done in your country, and you submit this to us. Because in the end, the implementation, no government can do that alone. You need to have the people there, you need to have the industry there, you need to have research institutions there, you need to bring everyone together to get there. And as Tukba also said, the other important element is that the Paris Agreement itself has no real sticks. It has a lot of carrots, but it doesn't. There is no climate police in here who would then send you to a climate jail if you don't live up to your NDC. So that is again also the role of the society, to look at your own country, your own NDC, your own targets, and say, how did we actually do? How did we fare here? How did we live up to it, or was it just an empty promise? And I think that is also underlying the Paris Agreement, that the general society, basically everyone is kind of responsible to implement it because what we are trying to achieve is really important for the entire society and can only be achieved with the society together. Thank you.
Bern and Tugba, thank you very much. I mean, we run out of time, but at the end, I think that your message is quite clear, and I think that it's encouraging for all of us to say that at the end, civil society owns the NDC and should demand transparency and implementation of them. So, having said that, I really thank you for your presentation. I really thank UNFCCC for joining forces with Let's Slack in doing this webinar. Remember that all the materials you will be able to find it in the Let's Slack website. So if you have any question or you would like to just see the presentation, you'll be able to find it there. So thank you again. Thank you very much for all of these quite interesting remarks, and hope to see you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
Thank you, and thank you for everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.